In the spring of 2019, Huawei's growth in smartphone sales was so strong that it was expected to become the global industry leader by Christmas, surpassing Samsung. Huawei was doing this without its CFO, who had been under house arrest in Vancouver for half a year. The Trump administration decided it could wait no longer, and it lowered the boom on Huawei. In May, Trump put Huawei on something called the Entity List, which meant that Huawei could no longer do business with any American company. Huawei phones could not ship with Google-owned applications pre-installed.
The U.S. government signed an executive order into effect that added Huawei to effectively a blacklist of companies that are restricted from doing any business with any U.S. company at all. Period.
Very nice phone, very happy with it, but it has one gigantic flaw. It does not work with Android Auto, and I want to show you today that it isn't and what is actually going wrong with it. It doesn't even let you choose between Waze and Google Maps, which it should. It doesn't, it just blocks. This is what is happening. Phone doesn't work, home screen doesn't work, audio doesn't work.
In effect, the company would have to completely revamp how it created and released smartphones. Huawei would no longer have access to the fundamentals of Android smartphones. No Gmail, YouTube, Google Drive, or even the Google Play Store itself.
Literally, the minute this ban came into effect, Huawei was completely cut off from its US suppliers. And so that innovation instantly halted.
With that one action, Washington had eliminated from the market the world's second most popular phone and the single most popular product Huawei sold. For a while, this action was described as a death sentence to Huawei. It was a death sentence read with a verdict, but without first a trial. Huawei had been aware that it was under U.S. investigation for some time. In 2012, a U.S. congressional committee began calling Chinese companies a national security threat. In the years that followed, national security was to be the reason given for all U.S. warnings and U.S. actions against Huawei. U.S. intelligence agencies scanned the globe, and when Huawei and a new country began to develop a relationship, U.S. officials sprung into action. The U.S. worked with its surveillance partner countries, from the powerful U.S. spy entity Five Eyes, to monitor Chinese companies and to launch counter-strikes against them through political channels. To cite one example, Huawei had in 2016 contracted to build a national broadband transmission network, providing internet connectivity for the Pacific country of Papua New Guinea. This and other small Pacific countries had relied primarily on a humble regional provider, Digicel, headquartered in Papua New Guinea, and Digicel had already happened to use mostly Huawei components. Soon after, the U.S. signals its Five Eyes partner Australia, which moved on Papua New Guinea, its one-time colonial possession, with offers of increased funding for state projects. In the fall of 2018, the U.S. and Australia announced funding for the modernization of the Lombrom Naval Military Base in Papua New Guinea, including the introduction of advanced naval vessels. Australian officials warned Papua New Guinean officials about security risks associated with Huawei. The implication was that to keep the military projects, the country needed to rip up contracts with Huawei. Papua New Guinea at first strongly defended its choice of Huawei Internet service. Then it agreed to allow Australian technical security experts to inspect the entire system that Huawei was installing. Australia soon after announced that its team had discovered data breaches and backdoors that the Chinese government was spying on Papua New Guinea. No evidence was produced. Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister James Marape at first remained committed to Huawei.
Papua New Guinea, PNG, is less than 5 kilometres from us. Can you give a wrought iron guarantee there will never be a Chinese military base, a Chinese naval base in your country?
On our behalf, on our funding, maybe yes, but Chinese military base, no.
Then, in the fall of 2021, Australia announced its own telecom company, Telstra, had acquired Digicel, the somewhat outdated provider, headquartered on Papua New Guinea and that had served Pacific countries for years.
Purely on the numbers, it's a pretty terrible business deal for the Australian taxpayer, but the government will go to great pains to emphasise that the deal is structured around loans and equity. And so the government is very confident that it will be making all of this money back. And the opportunity there was worth the risk for the Australian government.
So in regards to China's rising influence in the Pacific, how much of that do you think factored into the government's decision-making?
Oh, massively.
Hi, I'm Shelley Janice. As you've probably heard by now, Digicel has just been acquired by Telstra, Australia's largest mobile services provider. This is super exciting for us and big news for our industry.
The US and Australian government had both chipped in money to help Telstra close the deal and block off China. Telstra soon announced that all the Huawei equipment that Digicel had been relying on for years would be torn out and replaced with non-Chinese technology. A pattern emerged that became all too familiar. A country would announce a contract for 5G installation with Huawei. This would be followed by warnings to that country from U.S. officials, followed by pressure from U.S. officials, followed by ringing defenses of the Huawei contracts from the client country, followed by an investigation of the technology, the equipment on site in the client country, followed by announcements from the Huawei client that it had concluded that the Huawei equipment was, in fact, not secure. For its part, China and Huawei did not get mad, did not go public with complaints about how it was being outmaneuvered in Papua New Guinea by Western competitors. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China was already committed to the construction of an airport, a number of schools, highways, and medical supplies in that Pacific country. The people of Papua New Guinea still liked China. As always, China played the long game.
Chinese government threatening established democratic norms and the rule of law. We also see a coordinated effort across the Chinese government to lie, cheat, and steal their way into unfairly dominating entire technology sectors.
I really made the decision. It's much simpler not to do any business with Huawei, so we're not doing business with Huawei.
Secrets about its testing robot named Tappy.
Huawei entities directed employees to take photographs, take measurements, and take other protected information without permission. And finally, when all this still did not get them what they were looking for, they tried to steal Tappy's robotic arm.
Just talk to us about Huawei, why we're really trying to shut off any supplies from US manufacturers to Huawei.
This is all about isolating Huawei. The U.S. federal government has singled out Huawei as being a potential source of a threat.
We're deeply concerned about the risks of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values to gain positions of power inside our telecommunications networks.
That the freeze out by the US in particular of Huawei was driven in part by an incident that happened in Australia in 2012. The US and Australia, along with other countries that make up the Five Eyes, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, regularly share intelligence with each other. And former American officials we spoke to said that there was an incident involving an Australian telecommunications network where a software update was used to install essentially a digital wiretap that sent data to China.
The charge of national security risk is the most distressing economic tool that the U.S. can employ against China, because once the decision is made that a product or a company or a country creates a risk to national security, Washington is under no obligation to take its explanation any further. If the U.S. charges a Chinese company with bank fraud, what follows is an obligation to prove the accusation. But imposing the charge of national security threat transcends crime. Even to provide proof against China might itself constitute a further breach of U.S. national security. In the third year of Trump's presidency, the charges and the sanctions directed at Huawei and other Chinese companies tumbled forward, one after the other. After the smartphones, the next big U.S. target was Huawei 5G technology.
5G is a software-defined network. It means that while it won't replace cables entirely, it could replace the need for them by largely operating on the cloud instead. This means it will have 100 times better capacity than 4G, which will dramatically improve internet speeds. For example, to download a 2-hour film on 3G would take about 26 hours. On 4G, you'd be waiting 6 minutes, and on 5G, you'll be ready to watch your film in just over 3.5 seconds.
In 2019, Huawei's 5G was well ahead of its rivals, and the company had contracts in hand all over the world, including in several European countries. Banning Huawei 5G from the US was easy. The next step for the Trump administration was to extend the boycott to its allies.
That's why Australia's government says it decided to ban Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei from taking part in the rollout of the country's 5G communications network.
Now, we have recently seen disturbing reports about Chinese influence.
And we welcome foreign direct investment into New Zealand that really boosts and contributes to our productive economy. And that's a long-standing position. We have a very specific piece of legislation, though, that applies to our telecommunications sector. It's neutral in its application to vendor or country, but sets out a process separate of government to assess applications.
The Australian government and senior intelligence officials have called on Britain to ban Chinese telco Huawei from building ultra-fast mobile networks.
Huawei had been part of telecommunications in England since 2003. In 2015, England boasted of being, quote, China's best partner in the West, unquote. England had a pro-China foreign policy consensus. But then in America came the Trump administration and intense pressure on the UK to end its relationship with Huawei.
I say to all those who, the British public deserve to have access to the best possible technology. I've talked about infrastructure and technology. We want to put in a gigabit broadband for everybody. Now, if people oppose one brand or another, then they have to tell us what's the alternative.
Cooperation with Trump would be a complete reversal of the technological relationship between England and Huawei, and it would cost the UK a great deal of money. And with England, as with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, Trump could play the Five Eyes card. England could maintain access to Five Eyes intelligence reports, or it could have China. If England wanted Huawei, it would be disinvited from the Five Eyes spy group. The US was spinning the globe and trying to eradicate Huawei wherever it found it.
Brazil has rejected pressure from the United States to ban Huawei from bidding for the country's 5G network. Brazil's Minister
Solomon Islands has signed a deal with Chinese telco Huawei to build 161 telco towers in the Pacific Island nation. Beijing has moved to step up its influence in the Solomons this year.
Safaricom, which was supposed to be funded by the United States, went around in circles and finally chose to go with Huawei. Facts have proved that as long as there are no interference factors such as the United States, operators in various countries know how to choose. Therefore, although the United States hopes to use financial tools to stop Huawei, reality tells the United States that the funds needed to achieve these goals are not sustainable.
I feel highly honored to take the floor immediately after President Xi Jinping has made the much anticipated announcement of new measures.
The first thought that comes to mind is economic growth.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, the miracle that they pulled off, going from an predominantly agrarian economy to one of the manufacturing hubs of the world.
Of course, when President Xi was in South Africa, they signed further agreements and also decided there to elevate these relations to comprehensive strategic relationships there, South Africa, but this relationship with the entire African continent. And here, the Chinese president made it clear that this is just a relationship of friends really wanting to help each other. And then he made it clear that there are no conditions attached to it.
And what President Xi Jinping was saying yesterday was very much in line with the political perspective, because there is no need for any country to interfere in the affairs of any other country. Why do you want to interfere? Because the minute you want to interfere, it means that you are being patronizing.
Specifically, I came here to test the 5G from the vendors Nokia, which makes up most of London, and Huawei, which the highest I observed tipped the scales at over 460 megabits per second, which is a very nice number for the centre of the City of London. In addition, thanks to the flagship Huawei 46S 4G capacity solution deployed on this site, 4G performance was also excellent. Now, performance from this Nokia 5G site was quite variable. To facing me on the establishing shot, things weren't quite so nice. So there was a very high bit error rate and a very low reported SINR, which led to connection drops and detaches.
The 5G millimeter wave in the United States can only cover a range of 150 meters. Although the 5G signal in the United States is stronger, not only the wavelength is extremely short, but also the penetration is extremely weak. It is basically said that a building can block the signal. In general, Huawei's 5G is actually more applicable and requires lower economic costs.
In a few years, perhaps the entire world will be making use of 5G communication technology. China is already talking about leapfrogging ahead to 6G. And at the moment, China has that territory completely to itself. The next focus is the chips, advanced microchips. China, like every other advanced country in the 21st century, has always depended on trade relations with other advanced countries for some of its technological needs. And while China can mass produce low-performance microchips, it has been relying on Taiwan, Japan, and others for the newest, most advanced chips, which are necessary for things like supercomputing and AI. The first strategic strike in the U.S. chip war came in 2018 when the Trump administration pressured the AMSL company in the Netherlands not to sell its exclusive and expensive microchip printer to China, which could then produce larger quantities of the advanced chips itself. AMSL was yet another business in another country that was not keen to lose one of its best customers. Trump and a succession of officials from his government met with counterparts in the Netherlands, and eventually AMSL surrendered to U.S. power, losing what would have been a $200 million sale.
Donald J. Trump. Hij had een duidelijke boodschap voor de rest van de wereld. Ik neuk jullie allemaal de moeder. Nou ja, hij zei het in iets andere woorden.
This is a message from the government of the Netherlands.
Dear Mr. President, welcome to this introduction video about the Netherlands. We speak Dutch. It's the best language in Europe. We've got Pony Park Slagharen, which has got to be the best pony park in the world.
You've kind of beaten up a lot of these companies. Why did the Biden administration move to do this now?
Look at it. China consumes more than 75% of the semiconductors globally.
And I think this is beyond just impact in terms of revenue for Intel or Qualcomm or NVIDIA. Or, of course, we need to watch out for TSMC. But if they retaliate in other industries, this is going to be disastrous.
Companies in China are major customers for American chip designers, chip makers, too. There's an interesting report that BCG put out a few years ago that said that full tech control, as in a complete ban, could lead to upwards of 40% drop in revenue for some of these big names in the U.S.
A senior U.S. government official has revealed that the U.S. may place technology limits on semiconductors that South Korean companies produce in China. Washington is once again trying to keep Beijing in check by preventing advanced technology from flowing into the country.
Washington's attempt to keep China in check regarding the chip industry is causing worries for South Korean chip makers.
At the beginning of the story, you mentioned guidelines that restricted investment in China. Now, Korea was very concerned about that, but still the Korean companies did accept it. They will also have to reveal a lot of information, financial and technical, to the United States, and that also has Korean companies very worried.
What the U.S. government is offering is less revenue, less profits. And if I can make a quick contrast, we look at China with Zhengzhou, or sometimes it's called the iPhone City, which became a base for iPhone manufacturing throughout the world. The government provided a lot of incentives that increased revenue and increased profits. And I think that is what attracts multinationals, not the reverse.
In Taiwan, in South Korea, in the U.S., chip-making companies quickly found that U.S. restrictions cost them significant profits from sales lost to one of the best customers.
What are these chip makers and what are the chip making equipment companies telling you?
You know, most people realize it was necessary. We have to protect the American people against China, period, full stop.
From phones to 5G to microchips, Washington's determination to separate and undermine China is massively expensive to countries and to companies around the globe. Few of these parties actually believe that using Chinese technology presents any security risk, but they find it very difficult to refuse the American demands. Which brings us to Taiwan. Taiwan's importance in the tech world is undeniable. The country manufactures more than 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, and it's home to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, the world's most advanced chip factory. The CEO of Taiwan's TSMC, C.C. Wei, does not favor putting up fences between the participants in the technology industries. Wei says, geopolitical confrontation has distorted the entire market. Previously, you could make a product and sell it to the whole world. Export controls and banning products from other foreign countries destroys market productivity and efficiency gained under globalization. And it reduces benefits offered by a free market. Taiwan is important, but the world needs China too. For technology breakthroughs, in 2022, the company with the greatest number of new patent innovations was Huawei, with its 4,505 patent applications. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is assisting with the development of Biden's advanced chip project in Arizona. It appears that TSMC is investing in Arizona not for any financial or technological advantage to itself, but Taiwan feels dependent upon the United States. Arguably, TSMC going this route and agreeing to cut off China from advanced chips will slow down innovation rather than increase it. And it certainly chops away at the major percentage of company profits into the foreseeable future.
We underestimated the cost of going to the United States to build a factory. Recently, Zhang Zhengmo, founder of TSMC, expressed emotion at a symposium. He said frankly, TSMC's going to the United States to build a factory not only cost far more than expected, but also lacks a large number of talents and technologies in the United States. If one piece of equipment fails, the entire production line may stop.
Some TSMC employees are skeptical that their U.S. counterparts can suddenly develop the high-tech assembly skills that have been noticeably lacking from U.S. industry for decades. It was Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, who explained that it was nearly impossible for iPhones to be assembled any place other than China because of the number of highly skilled laborers required.
The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is.
Biden wants the U.S. to develop microchip independence. That is, the ability to mass produce its own microchips. The whole point of the multi-billion-dollar investment in Phoenix. For now, the U.S. is almost entirely dependent upon Taiwanese chips. Washington politicians make promises to the Taiwanese about protecting them from the PRC. But if the U.S. reaches chip self-sufficiency, will the U.S. have as much reason to protect Taiwan as it does at this moment? Taiwan is supposed to sacrifice half of its chip trade because the U.S. demands it. Then Taiwan is supposed to help the U.S. become advanced enough in chip manufacturing that it, the U.S., no longer needs to buy chips from anybody, including Taiwan. So to satisfy America, Taiwan is to walk away from its best customer and eventually lose its second best customer. The U.S. determination to keep advanced microchips out of Chinese hands is another example of thinking backward instead of looking forward. U.S. strategy toward China is preventative in nature, which may reassure Washington planners, but does not inspire confidence in the U.S. internationally. When the world looks on, it is not just demonstrations of power that win respect. The world also judges the U.S. by its consistency with American ideals, such as freedom, respect for human rights, democracy, goodwill beyond its own borders. Decoupling instead announces that the American preference is with us or against us, with America choosing the right countries and the wrong countries. Mark Sheehan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace writes that one of the effects of the U.S. refusing to let other countries sell its components to China means foreign companies will work to develop their own replacement parts for their products. Such companies, bleached of U.S. technology, can then resume sales to what had been their biggest customer year after year. The US companies then, within 3 or 4 years, could find themselves with reduced sales because foreign customers are trying hard to escape US costly demands upon them. The US cut off Huawei networking because, it said, it fears China using advanced microchips in their fighter jets and other military applications. But if the most advanced microchip is indispensable for military applications, especially if you are a world superpower, how likely is it then that China will simply concede that it got outsmarted by the US and that it must get by without the best microchips and without the best fighter jets? The US made it clear many years ago that oil is a national security concern and that if our oil supply were threatened, we would not hesitate to protect it militarily. And we've done so.
The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly.
Well, in their own way, microchips are the national security imperative for the 21st century, for the US and for China. We would not allow another country to cut us off from what we thought of as our rightful oil supply. Neither would we sit back if a rival state jeopardized our access to advanced microchips. So what would make us think that China will allow the US to block it off from advanced chips? But all 3 of TSMC's major operational plants are within a few miles of the coast, opposite the Chinese mainland. If a war were going on all around and overhead, could the factories remain without a scratch? What about the electrical grid that keeps them running? Could the engineers become war casualties? The surest way to be certain that TSMC keeps making precious chips is to do everything to avoid a conflict at all, and not to devote weeks and months and years into planning for elaborate war scenarios as Washington has been doing. And then there's the effort to block China off from the world's scientific developments. Technological advances, particularly those that have military uses, are all but impossible to keep confined. Consider the atom bomb. The US was ready to use the bomb by the summer of 1945. And the last thing the US wanted was for the Soviet Union to also have this advanced a weapon. The USSR of 1945 was far less advanced technologically and economically than is China today. Yet with no US assistance, it took only 3 years from the US nuclear detonation in 1945 for the Soviet Russians to explode their own bomb in 1948. China has already made clear its determination to get the chips, which it sees as crucial to the next generation of phones, appliances, and military equipment. The US is attempting to put China into a deep freeze. Semiconductors are the main battlefield of the current China-US technology war, said one Chinese scientist recently. So does Washington think it was a good trade-off to withhold the chips and to get a war? In technology, companies and countries share and learn from each other and compete. Once upon a time, Toshiba, a Japanese company, was more advanced in semiconductors than Samsung. Samsung was able to leapfrog technologically by acquiring equipment from a Japanese competitor of Toshiba and getting circuitry designs from a US company, Micron. Samsung then set up a research and development facility in Silicon Valley, California, and after a couple of years, produced chips ahead of any Japanese semiconductor. Samsung continues to rely on US for some parts and Japanese companies for some other. This is the way of technological growth. It becomes very onerous to the industry if a company is cut off from exchanges or acquisitions from developers in the other key countries. Not surprisingly, PRC has recently begun pouring money into the companies that are already producing lower grade chips, and Huawei has started work on advanced microchip development. They got ahead in phones and then in 5G. Does anyone doubt they will figure out microchips? Technology and technological products and progress flow around the globe in a continuous stream like a river that passes through multiple countries. The United States has in its mind that it can block off large parts of the stream without impairing the flow that reaches everyone else. To date, China's response to this technological blockade has been almost negligible. But what if in a retaliation, China withholds sale of products or materials that these countries depend on? China is the world's #1 producer of the batteries that go into electric cars. China is the major resource for 17 precious metals. Ironically, the radical changes that the US is imposing on the PRC make its economy state-controlled and undemocratic. In a free market system, you don't sanction your competitor. In a free market, people who make phones or who make chips put their best work on the table and the customers decide. In a closed market, in an autocracy, yes, you might expect the government to step in and say, you can't buy this one, you must buy this one. Chinese citizens can buy iPhones, but American citizens can't buy Huawei. What has Washington done to the free market? Also, in democracy, you wouldn't force your allies in other countries to adopt the same anti-free market rules on goods that you are imposing on your own people. That's not just autocratic, that's autocratic beyond your own borders. What Washington has been trying to do to Chinese companies since at least the Obama administration is bad economics, as anyone on Wall Street would tell them, if he were asked. China is the other largest economy on Earth, and every regulation, every sanction, every intervention into the business world that Washington has taken hurts U.S. markets.
这种行动的结果就是搬起石头砸自己的脚。
Washington is saying we no longer need the access we once had to 1/3 of the globe's customers. How strategic is that? Cutting off and undermining a provider also reduces innovation across the market. China in recent years graduates the highest number of STEM scientists and registers the greatest number of technology patents. We should want access to China's innovations. (1889). If Washington had embraced the product of Thomas Edison and forbade any use of the product of Nikola Tesla, we'd all be relying on direct current electricity today instead of alternating current. The free market gave us a choice, and thankfully, Mr. Edison lost. And what did Edison do after Tesla's Westinghouse won the most business for alternating current? Edison's company diversified, left DC for AC, and gradually became bigger than ever. Edison would never have needed to improve his industrial and technological model if the government had stepped in and picked him as the winner, ahead of any free market competition.
Think of what Apple has done by engaging in a partnership with China as a big supplier. It's been good for Apple and good for China. That's the kind of business we ought to be doing with China. Everything that increases the tension between the two companies is stupid, stupid, stupid.
China is moving along at warp speed. And we're moving along at snail speed. And they're going to surpass us. And we're creating our own problem. And I don't understand why we're creating our own problem.
Remember, this trip was meant to neutralize or sort of match up the influence that China has in Africa. The only difference is China comes with money, goodies, projects, and China does not try to impose its values and what it thinks is right on Africans.
I think there is nothing written in stone that says that two superpowers can't coexist peacefully without a war. I mean, we surpassed Great Britain without a war.
Apple CEO Tim Cook was recently in Beijing to attend the China Development Forum, which is a government-organized event. It seems the Apple CEO is seeking to maintain a mutually beneficial relationship with the Chinese government.
China's done an unbelievable job of lifting people out of poverty, and we should all applaud that.
There's nothing that unites Democrats and Republicans today like anti-China rhetoric and sentiment. And this is something that we should all be concerned about. We need to find common ground with China for a global economic system to work, for us to have peace, prosperity, stability. We don't need another Cold War.
The report is called Patchwork Globalization. I mean, that's what you described in this bipolarization. It's one market in China, and then there's one market rest of the world. And that really is very bad for the economic integration, and it risks the collapse of economies of scale, which drive efficiency and competition as we know it.
We think overall, getting China back into the global economic mix can be very, very positive.
If you're going to be a global company, you've got to play by both a global set of rules, but also local sets of rules. We very much understand ourselves to be a local citizen with our China consumers and our China team. Phil Knight entered China 40 years ago.
And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.